in 1812. As soon as the Louisiana Purchase was finalized, the city really began to grow, and it was still the main export port for those living west of the Appalachians. In spite of sandbars at the Mississippi River, it was still the port of deposit. The Erie Canal was still 10 years away. The introduction of the railroads, in 1815 they weren't even known about. It would be at least another 15 to 20 years before the railroads would begin pulling some of that trade away. So New Orleans was definitely the wealthy port of deposit and export port for a very, very wide area, and a wide area of the United States that was growing very dramatically at that time, west of the Appalachians. New Orleans was indeed a melting pot, and we already had a French population, we already had an African population, we'd had a great influx of people from Saint-Domingue, both African and French Caucasian, who actually helped sort of intensify the French roots as well as the African roots of the city. And of course, those roots were not British, but they were also concerned about their own business relations here too. So on the one hand, they most likely didn't want to fall to the British, but if they did, they would hope that the British would be understanding and receptive to their business connections here as well. But free people of color, I think, would have probably been less prone to want to see the city fall to the British than, say, the slaves, because I understand that the British were looking to free the slaves in this area, and you did have a city that was approximately 50-50 at that time, black and white, and approximately 50% of the black population would have been slaves. And of course, when you go into the plantation country surrounding the city, you'd have had a much larger proportion of African, people of African descent who would have been slaves. So I would suspect that they would be more in favor of a British victory. One of the things I've been working on is an article about the hurricane of 1812, which up to that point was probably the worst storm to hit this area, and for the next nearly half a century it would become kind of the benchmark storm. But by that time, the British blockade, August the 19th of 1812, the British blockade was already in place at the mouth of the river, and the newspapers I think we're rather pleased to report that the blockade had been scattered and that HMS Brazen had been driven ashore and dismasted, and his crew was all seasick from the storm. So, as soon as war was declared in June, New Orleans was already beginning to feel the impact of blockade, and British subjects were already being instructed to report to the local marshals. The city was an island. It still is, probably more so than it was then. But when the British came into the city, coming along the river, they had the river on one side, they had the swamps on the other side, and they really had no place to go other than straight ahead into the guns of the Americans or backwards. And they weren't necessarily familiar with the swamplands around there, but the swampland was very, very dense, and much of it was flooded as well. So, they sort of were funneling themselves into a rather serious situation. But New Orleans in itself was indeed an isolated community. It was isolated from the rest of the United States. The nearest big cities were Charleston to the east, to the north. Cities like Cincinnati hadn't even, although Cincinnati was certainly around by 1815, it was still not a particularly large community. So New Orleans was a very isolated town from the rest of the United States, but then it was surrounded by so much water, and just as today, you can just see this island of a city, this urban area completely surrounded either by swamps or canals or lakes or rivers or bayous or what have you, and the only way you could get in and out of the city was via water. At that time, even via horseback. You could travel the river road, but it was much easier to take a water route, either the river or through Lake Pontchartrain out into the Gulf of Mexico. Panic. I think anyone who thinks a city is going to be invaded by warring country would panic. I think we'd probably panic today if we thought that another power was coming and attempting to take our city, because you have no idea what's going to happen. You know, you don't know if the city's going to be burned, if you're going to lose your property, what the casualty rate would be. So panic was certainly anything that would have occurred in any city with the thought of an enemy coming at you. He was one of the illegal traders in Barataria, and Barataria then meant the whole area on the west bank of the Mississippi, on the other side of the river from New Orleans, all the way down to the Gulf Coast itself. It was an area filled with bayous. There were plantation canals. Many of the plantation dealers, plantation owners, dealt with the smugglers who were in that area. So it was a major trading area, so to speak. You know, there were markets that were set up where goods were sold to people from New Orleans. And again, here you had a growing city, a wealthy city, where people were in the market for a number of goods, and they helped provide the city with that and the people in the surrounding area. There was a cult of Napoleon that formed in New Orleans. He was very important to many people here, and of course, you know, there's still almost a cult of Napoleon in Europe and in the United States. But there are many people in New Orleans who looked up to Napoleon. They saw him as a hero of France and a hero of their French culture. But it's sort of interesting, after the Battle of New Orleans, for many people, it became sort of more of a cult of Jackson, the hero of New Orleans. After that, as New Orleans was becoming more American, by the time you start getting into the 18-teens and 1820s, it was becoming a more American city. So they were looking for a hero to replace an earlier hero. Gosh, in the late 50s, I guess, what's his name, Johnny Horton, brought back the Battle of New Orleans, because I think a lot of people didn't even realize the battle had existed. And as inaccurate as the song was, it became very, very popular. And I think there was a resurgence. And I think there's a growing interest in history, especially local history. And I think that's why you're seeing more and more interest in the Battle of New Orleans, although certainly if you go back to 1915, the 100th anniversary of the battle was something that was recognized, and it was recognized in 1965 for the 150th anniversary. So I suppose as we approach more the 200th anniversary, we're going to see more and more interest in that battle. And I think there's growing interest in it as part of American history. There's certainly a number of Jacksonian scholars around, and in their study of Andrew Jackson, the Battle of New Orleans becomes a very important part of that. So the two go hand in hand. I think the Battle of New Orleans, perhaps more so than the war, I think the Battle of New Orleans had impact of pride in the United States, because here the United States proved that it could defeat one of the crown jewels of armies from Europe. And for a number of decades, the Battle of New Orleans was regarded as a point of American pride. When you consider some of the paintings and the annual recognition of the battle in magazines like the Frank Leslie's and Harper's Weekly and other magazines of the 1850s and 60s, showing images of the battle and mentioning annually the anniversary of the battle, more so then than you certainly see now. Well, it proved to Americans in the other parts of the United States that people in Louisiana would willingly fight for the United States, because when Louisiana became a state in 1812, there were some who questioned the loyalty of the Francophile citizens of Louisiana, and there was concern that if Louisiana ever had a chance, it would turn back and become part of the French Empire if that ever grew again. The Battle of New Orleans, though, proved to the rest of the United States that New Orleans was certainly a loyal community. It was going to be loyal to the United States.
When the War of 1812 broke out, Louisiana had just been admitted as a state. It had been a territory for 9 years before that, and it still had not really been Americanized. New Orleans was, to the Northeasterners, was a foreign country. It was an international port, sort of like Tangier. There were the French speakers, the Spanish speakers, there were Indians, there were Creole speakers, there were some Americans who had come down, but basically the power structure was still French. And it was like someone described it just a few years later as arriving at the Tower of Babel, that people were speaking every language under the sun and there were all the types. So it was a very atypical American city, but an exciting one, and one that was about to take off and become a boomtown. New Orleans was actually ahead of the rest of the United States in being a melting pot, because the East Coast colonies were not yet anything like a melting pot. They had some immigrants, but basically they were very English dominated, and that's why New Orleans seems so different. Someone has described it as being an experiment in diversity. And it sort of got people in the rest of the country accustomed to the idea of having a lot of different people from different backgrounds living in the same place. The truth is that New Orleanians and the rest of the settlers in South Louisiana had not wanted to be purchased by the United States. They did not want to be an American town, an American colony, or even an American state. They were pretty much dragged in kicking and screaming. But by this time, people had started to see the advantages that there were. So I think it's understandable why the French upper classes came in and took part, because they had their own city to protect, quite apart from the United States. For the free men of color, it was a chance to show the slave-owning, very racist Americans that these free men of color were loyal, that they were wonderful fighters, and that they could come through when need be. And they probably protected their own rights for many years to come, because being the victors at the battle, being important components, helped maintain their own reputation. They couldn't just be shoved aside the way free people of color were in other southern states. A lot of the people who were fighting weren't really fighting for the United States. They were fighting to keep those rascally British soldiers out of their city. Wellington once described his troops after he had been fighting the French and the Spanish in the Spanish Peninsula. He described his British troops as rascals and some of the toughest men on earth. Also, they were fighters from hell, that they won. But once they won, the amount of rape, pillage, drunken revelry, killings of civilians, those things happened all over Spain. There's no sense thinking those soldiers were civilized, because they weren't. They were men who worked for very minimum wages, who actually had no interest, most of them, in joining the army. Lots of them were what were called pressed. Gangs went out, went to taverns where people were drunk, hit likely-looking candidates with lots of muscles over the head, and when they woke up, they found themselves in the King's Army. So these guys had to get some perks with their jobs, and rape and looting were part of the perks. It was an awful time for the women of New Orleans, because although there was a lot of coming and going, Chalmette's not that far away, so they knew as each part of the action took place. But of course they didn't know what the final result would be, and had Jackson lost, they would have discovered it when Jackson's troops came fleeing into the city, pursued by these British soldiers. And of course Jackson's fallback plan was to burn the city. So if he didn't win, New Orleans was going to lose, whether it was from Jackson or from the British soldiers. The city would go up in flames. So of course the women were terrified. Now, not just the nuns, the Ursuline nuns and their pupils were praying, but all the women were praying. And they took an active part in that they got together supplies, and our men were well fed and had plenty of what they needed in terms of food and drink and all. But they also helped to go house to house to collect guns and ammunition and powder and the important things, and also clothes, because a lot of those backwoods troops who came from Kentucky and Tennessee came pretty much in rags and tatters. And it was cold at this time of year. So the women of the city sewed shirts, Indian type hunting shirts and breeches, and collected shoes, and in general acted as kind of a ladies' aid to the army. So they were very important, really. The funny thing is, people have said, well, why didn't they evacuate? It's sort of like what they say now. Why doesn't everybody evacuate before the hurricane comes? Because there aren't that many ways out of this town, and it's a long way to go before you end up someplace. And there were very fewer some places back in those days. Had the women all jumped in carts and ridden away, where would they have gone exactly, where the British soldiers couldn't have caught up with them? I mean, there weren't mountains, there wasn't any place very accessible where they could go and hide. And so I think it was almost like a, I don't know, I can't think of the word, a fatalistic feeling that the Americans just had to win, that their men fighting with General Jackson had to win, because there wasn't a fallback plan, and it wasn't a very big town, and it wasn't as if there were cellars to hide in. There are no cellars. People would just be here. The Battle of New Orleans was one of those watersheds. People sometimes poo-poo it and say, oh, well, it was fought after the treaty had already been signed. Well, it was fought before the treaty was ratified, and certainly all treaties are not ratified by any means. But aside from that, it was this incredible psychological event, and having the people of New Orleans, the upper classes, the French Creoles, the free men of color, slaves, some slaves were there, Indians, having all of these people out there fighting what was an American battle gave New Orleans a new kind of American identity in the eyes of the rest of the nation, and probably in their own eyes too. I think New Orleans sort of went, well, I guess we are part of this place after all. So it was very important, and of course it made Andrew Jackson president.
If you want to be honest about it, it was set out to be a land grab. I'm from Michigan originally, and we're right next door to Canada. So in the process, I have discovered that on 6 different occasions in the American Revolution, in the War of 1812, the United States invaded Canada, but was never successful in holding anything. So that's a chauvinistic background that was motivating a lot of Americans. There was a grander scheme in the long run. There was the recognition that New England would possibly secede. If New England seceded, they would, and they had sent emissaries to Nova Scotia and had contact with the British, so that when they seceded, the British would recognize them as an independent country and come to their support. If the British then could also capture the Mississippi Valley, they had enveloped the coastal United States, because if they controlled the Mississippi Valley, their intention was to create an Indian nation in the Great Lakes area. From there south to the Illinois country was to be a refuge for Indians who were allies of the British. And if they controlled the lower Mississippi Valley, then they had all the commercial and all of the wealth of the Mississippi Valley accessible to them. So if they would control New Orleans, control the Mississippi Valley, and in effect, encircle the United States. With New England seceded, they would contain what was left of the United States east of the Alleghenies. As a one-time practitioner of amphibious warfare, I analyzed it and I say the big mistake that they made in executing the invasion here and in Louisiana and setting up for the Battle of New Orleans is they forgot the landing craft. They were supposed to buy some lighterage from the Dutch. They were also trying to gather some together at Jamaica before they undertook the operation, but they did not have any light craft to bring the troops, the ammunition, the cannon ashore. And they wound up 80 miles out and having to row everything ashore. Just a terrible logistic nightmare. Jackson was one remarkable individual. A lot of people criticize his attitudes. However, it was his dominating will that created the amalgamation of the forces here that put all of these people together. All these people who didn't much like each other in ordinary times. You start out with 50 or so Choctaw Indians. You got 56 United States Marines from different ships and different locales. Then you've got the militia from 4 different states with different levels of training and equipment. You've got 2 understrength regiments of the regular army. Then you have the Baratarians. Then you have the 2 battalions of free men of color, each one commanded by a white nominal colonel, but who really were commanded by the 2nd level of the free men of color. These fellows had fought in Saint-Domingue, most of them. They had fought in some of them. In fact, Saint-Gem had fought as an officer under the British when the British made an incursion into Saint-Domingue. So he had experience, and most of these free men of color had fought as well. And they weren't just hastily thrown together. They knew how to drill. They knew how to march. When Jackson saw the 1st Battalion, which was formed by Lacoste, he then turned around and said, "Can we get another battalion like this?" Because they knew how to drill, they knew how to form, and they knew how to maneuver. Many of them had fought in Saint-Domingue previously. And so they said, "Sure, we'll form up another battalion." So they formed 2 battalions of approximately 300 men each, who were in the center of the battle line at Chalmette. The British were defeated by the terrain. They had not adequately reconnoitered, and they were not adequately supported with small craft. And they got ashore, and they did remarkably well with what they got ashore. The battle on the night of the 23rd, 24th set them back a bit because they thought the Americans were much stronger than they really were because of Jackson's aggressive counterattack at that point. And they said, "Wait a minute, we are going to have to back off and get more of our forces ashore before we can make an attempt on New Orleans." Whereas, if they had actually pushed on right then, they would have walked right into New Orleans. But their hesitation gave Jackson time enough to build his defensive position. If you give me a choice, did Pakenham lose or did Jackson win? I'd have to say Jackson won it. He was such a dominating personality that he pulled all these people together who didn't much like each other in ordinary times. But on that day at Chalmette, they all decided they were Americans.